I'd just start by saying when I was invited by Chamber Choir Ireland to contribute to this series with the date 1660 to 1760, my thoughts jumped immediately to George Frederick Handel. Then it occurred to me that Mr. Handel was only in Dublin for 9 months, from 18th November 1741 until the 13th of August 1742. There was much more happening in choral music in Dublin, both before and after his visit. I needed to look at the bigger picture and to get Handel's visit in context. Musical activity in 17th and 18th century Dublin has already been featured in this series. Last year, Trina O'Hanlon gave a most entertaining talk on Georgian glees, catches and clubs. Next week, Kerry Houston will deal with cathedral music in Dublin, 1660 to 1800. I intend to focus on secular choral music in Dublin, composers, performers, concerts, and repertoire. But first, I thought it would be a good idea to revisit the city of Dublin and to recall some of the history of that time. In fact, the dates 1660 and 1760 are significant historical markers. In 1660, after the death of Oliver Cromwell, the exiled Charles II was restored as King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. 100 years later, in 1760, George III, the first English-born Hanoverian monarch, was crowned King of Great Britain and Ireland. In 1661, the Irish Parliament had been reinstated and Dublin became the seat of the Viceregal Court and the location for the judiciary, commerce, finance and trade. After the end of the Williamite War in 1691, there was an influx of English, Scots and Huguenot settlers in Dublin. In 1706, Dublin's population was estimated at 62,000. In 1710, it was the 5th largest city in Europe. And by 1740, the population had almost doubled to around 110,000 people. Churches, hospitals, music halls, and theatres were being built as the city outgrew its medieval centre and began to expand, both north and south of the Liffey. Dublin Castle, first founded in 1204 on the orders of King John, was rebuilt after a fire in 1684 and gradually transformed from a medieval fortress to a Georgian palace. In 1662, Phoenix Park was established as a royal hunting park, and St. Stephen's Green was mapped out as a public space in 1684. The Royal Hospital Kilmainham was built from 1680 to 84 by royal command from Charles II for disabled soldiers and pensioners, predating Chelsea Hospital in London by 2 years. The Royal Barracks, renamed Collins Barracks from 1922, which houses the National Museum today, was constructed between 1704 and 1710. Incidentally, it's funny the thing to learn when you're looking for other things. It's the oldest, longest serving army base in the world when it closed. It was there from 1704 to 1997, 293 years. A new custom house was built at Essex Quay in 1704. Marsh's Library, the first public library in Ireland, was opened in 1707. So all those things were happening. Edward Lovett Pearce was an Irish architect who played a very important role in changing the face of Dublin in the early 18th century. He had travelled to Italy on the Grand Tour and had come across the Palladian style of architecture there. He had very good family connections, and when he came back from Italy, his first commission was Castletown House in County Kildare for William Connolly, the Speaker of the Irish Parliament. Next, he was elected an MP for Ratoath, County Meath, and in 1729 he was chosen to design the new Parliament buildings at College Green. In 1732, he was knighted In 1733, he was awarded the freedom of the city, but he died later that year at the early age of 34. A German architect called Richard Cassells had worked with Pearce on the Parliament building, and he carried on where Pearce left off. In 1734, his first solo work was the printing house in Trinity College, which you can still look at today. He designed 2 houses for the Earl of Kildare, Carton House, County Kildare, in 1739, and in 1745, a townhouse known today as Leinster House. In 1741, we're getting to it last, he was commissioned by the Charitable Musical Society to build a music hall at Fishandle Street, known as Mr. Neil's Great Room, after the treasurer of the society, William Neil, whose family dominated the Dublin music trade. It could seat 700 people and opened with a Charitable Musical Society concert on the 2nd of October 1741, just in time for Handel's visit. Between 1660 and 1760, there were 7 monarchs on the English throne. The viceroys were the monarchs' representatives in Ireland. They weren't required to live here permanently. Most only stayed when Parliament was in session. In 1691, the penal laws were enacted by the Irish Parliament sitting in Dublin, confirming the domination of the Protestant ascendancy. This was the society which supported and contributed to musical life in Dublin in the 17th and the 18th century. Before we go any further, we're going to listen to an excerpt of choral music that was heard in Dublin in 1694. It's a modern performance, of course, and I won't give the composer's name until afterwards.
At chiefly recommend to fair Maria and great William's name, great William's name, great William's name, great William's name, chiefly recommend his name. Maria, great William's name, for surely no
The composer was Henry Purcell, and that was from his ode, Great Parent Hail, which was commissioned from him for the centenary of Trinity College, Dublin. Of course, when that was performed first, the treble voices would have been sung by boy choristers, not by the beautiful sopranos we heard there. It was first performed on the 9th of January, 1694, by the principal gentlemen of the kingdom, with the cathedral choirs and strings, foreshadowing the vogue for oratorio in Dublin 47 years later. And it's interesting that some sources give Trinity College as the venue, others Christ Church Cathedral. It's not quite sure where exactly it was performed. In preparing for this talk, I'm indebted to many people, as you can see on the handout, for their research on music in Dublin. In particular, the last book on the list, the Encyclopedia of Music in Ireland, has contributions on the composers I'm going to talk about by Barbara Boydell, Kerry Houston, and David Rhodes. In addition, in 2017, Peter Whelan, founder and director of Ensemble Marseilles, who has just been appointed director of the Irish Baroque Orchestra, brought a unique series of concerts with the title Rediscovering Irish State Music to audiences at the Kilkenny Arts Festival and in St. Patrick's Hall, Dublin Castle. Some of you may have been there. The programmes of these concerts featured not only music by Handel, Purcell, Choral and Vivaldi, but also works by immigrant composers who stayed in Dublin much longer than Mr. Handel. Like Handel, many foreign musicians realised that Dublin, as a capital city, second only in size in the British Isles to London, presented very good musical opportunities. They found employment in the cathedrals and churches, in the city music band, in the theatres, and in the Irish state music in Dublin Castle. In 1703, the English violinist and composer William Vyner was appointed the first master of the state music in Dublin Castle and stayed in that position until his death in 1716. The duties of master of the state music were to compose birthday odes for the reigning monarch and to provide music for balls and festive occasions, state church services and official ceremonies. There were also special services, such as for St. Cecilia's Day or thanksgivings for military victories and the signing of treaties. The chorus and treble soloists were from the cathedral choirs, with the principal soloists sometimes from the theatres. Performances of the birthday odes at Dublin Castle took place at noon. They were preceded by an official procession to the castle, followed by a banquet with bell ringing and cannon firing. There was a play in the evening at Smock Alley Theatre and fireworks over the Liffey later on. In 1716, William Wyner was succeeded by the Hungarian composer Johann Sigismund Kuster, who had come to Dublin in 1707 and remained there until his death 20 years later. I'm always amazed at how much musicians travelled in those days before Ryanair. Kuster was born in Pressburg, today it's Bratislava, studied the French style in Versailles with Lully, travelled extensively in Germany, visited Italy, ended up in London before he arrived in Dublin. In 1711, Kuster composed a chamber opera for Queen Anne's 46th birthday. The impressive title was The Universal Applause of Mount Parnassus, a Senorata da Camera, to be represented on the birthday of the most serene Anne, by the grace of God, Queen of Great Britain, etc. The printed score of the libretto is in Trinity College Dublin Library. Very few of the music scores of these odes have survived, but Kuster's score for that work was discovered recently in the Bodleian Library, Oxford. On the 12th of June 2015, the work was performed by Ensemble Marseilles, appropriately in the Chapel Royal, Dublin Castle, during the Great Houses Festival. We're very fortunate to have a recording of this performance, and we will listen now to an extract as an example of Kuster's choral music. It is a chaconne, or ground, in which the bass part is repeated over and over against different upper parts. It's almost hypnotic, all that repetition. But I suppose that's what pop music is like today. The English violinist and composer Matthew Dubourg, who succeeded Cousar, first came to Dublin in 1721 and joined the Irish State Music in 1723. In 1727, he returned to London. A year later, he came back to Dublin, where he was appointed chief composer and master of the music, attending His Majesty's State in Ireland. He certainly had to work very hard. He had to write birthday odes for the reigning monarchs and for their wives, and sometimes for their children. He composed 31 odes between 1730 and 1767, but the music of only 4 survives in manuscript and may be incomplete. Dubourg was a very active figure as a violinist in musical circles in Dublin. He led the orchestras for numerous charity concerts, for the Irish premiere in 1741 of Thomas Arne's Masque, Comus, and in 1741 and 42 for 2 series of Handel's subscription concerts, advertised as musical entertainments. Most famously, he was the orchestral leader for the first and second performances of Messiah. Handel had a high opinion of Dubourg. He had heard him play the violin in London in 1712 as a child prodigy and had often given him employment there. On the 29th of December 1741, after the first musical entertainment in the new music hall, Handel wrote a long letter to Charles Jennens, librettist of Messiah. He gave a very enthusiastic account of the audience, the performance, and the singers. Quote, "As for the instruments, they are really excellent, Mr. Dubourg being at the head of them, and the music sounds delightfully in this charming room." After Handel's departure from Dublin, Dubourg continued to promote his works. In 1743 to 44, he organised a subscription series of Handel's oratorios and the first Irish performances of Samson and Judas Maccabeus. He was the only composer that Handel included in his will, with the bequest of £100. The members of the Rosengrave family were not employed by the state music, but they were very active in Dublin as organists, cathedral musicians and composers. Their father, Daniel, was born in England in 1655, but may have been of Irish descent. He was an organist in Gloucester, Winchester and Salisbury cathedrals, and he moved to Dublin with his young sons in 1698 as organist and stipendiary at Christchurch Cathedral and organist at St. Patrick's Cathedral. All those musicians were double jobbing, I don't know how they did. His combined pay in Christchurch was £40 per annum, and he earned extra money by copying parts and other musical services. Daniel's eldest son, Ralph, who was appointed a vicar choral at St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1718 and became joint organist there with his father a year later. Well, that was good, he was helping. Was the most prolific Dublin cathedral composer of the early 18th century. I don't want to trespass on Curly Houston's lecture next week on music in the Dublin cathedrals, but Ralph Rosengrave's anthems remained among the most popular repertoire in Christchurch Cathedral well into the 19th century, and they're still performed there sometimes. Meanwhile, Ralph's younger brother, Thomas, who sounds like a difficult teenager, had dropped out of Trinity College, Dublin, without completing his degree. However, as the organist's son, he was granted funding by the Dean and Chapter of St. Patrick's Cathedral to study music in Italy, where he became a friend of Domenico Scarlatti. While he was studying in Venice, Thomas composed an anthem, "Arise, Shine, for thy light has come," for soloists, chorus and orchestra to celebrate the Peace of Utrecht at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. He was probably back in Dublin on the 9th of June 1713, when his anthem was first performed in Christchurch for the viceregal celebrations of the event. Thomas Rosengrave was not the only composer to celebrate the Peace of Utrecht. With admirable timing, Handel composed the Utrecht Te Deum and Jubilate while he was still working for the Elector of Hanover, and he had it ready for performance in London when the treaty was signed. It was rehearsed in public in St. Paul's Cathedral on the 5th of July 1713 and was premiered there at a Thanksgiving service 2 days later in the presence of Queen Anne, placing him at the centre of London's musical life. 23 years later, on the 8th of April 1736, the work was first performed in Dublin at the first benefit concert for Mercer's Hospital in St. Andrew's Round Church. It was such a success that it was repeated at Mercer's benefit concerts for 35 years. Handel himself heard it in Dublin in 1741 when he attended the annual Mercer's concert less than a month after he had arrived in Dublin. Lord Mornington led the orchestra at that concert. He was a musical prodigy and was then only 13 and a half years old. 3 months later, he conducted the work again at another Thanksgiving service in Christchurch Cathedral to celebrate another piece. They were always celebrating piece of Aix la Chapelle. Mornington became a very important figure in Dublin musical life. In 1757, he co-founded the Musical Academy, which was the first musical institution in the British Isles to admit women members. He was the first professor of music at TCD too. His choral music was composed after 1760, so it's too late for our consideration today. Dean Swift, whose 350th anniversary was celebrated last year, was Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral from 1713 until his death in 1745. He admitted that he lacked musical knowledge, but was determined to maintain high standards for the cathedral choir and consulted musical friends about engaging new singers. As soon as organised choral music became a part of musical life in Dublin, professional singers from the cathedrals were in such demand that Dean Swift feared that this would lead to the detriment of their official duties in the cathedral. When 3 singers from the choir in St. Patrick's, quote, presumed to sing and fiddle at a club of fiddlers in Fishamble Street without leave, he didn't mince his words. He threatened, quote, to punish such figures as shall ever appear there as songsters, fiddlers, pipers, trumpeters, drummers, drum majors, or in any zonal quality, according to the litigious aggravations of their respective disobedience, rebellion, perfidy, and ingratitude. The event in question was probably Handel's first concert in Dublin on the 23rd of December, 1741. A month later, perhaps unaware of the Dean's tirade, Handel gave an organ recital to a numerous congregation in the cathedral. It is not known whether the Dean attended. The extreme weather of 1740 and the famine that followed in 1741 had severe effects on the city's charitable organisations. There was a high mortality rate among the sick poor and an upsurge in charity concerts. In January 1743, Handel agreed to hold a performance for the benefit of 3 charities: Mercer's Hospital, the Charitable Infirmary, and the Charitable Musical Society for the Release of Imprisoned Debtors. The choirs of Christchurch and St. Patrick's Cathedral would be required. There was no problem getting permission for this from Christchurch, but Dean Swift was entrenched in his opposition to the choristers from St. Patrick's performing, quote, in any public musical performances, excepting churches, without the joint permission of both deans and chapters first had and obtained. This created a very serious problem because the majority of the vicar choral were employed by both cathedrals. On the 28th of January 1742, the Dean issued a further order to the Sub-Dean and Chapter of St. Patrick's, reinforcing his opposition to allow choir members to, quote, sing and fiddle at the club above mentioned. Swift's fragile mental and physical state of health at that time must have caused him to forget that on the previous day he had actually given permission for vicars, choral and boy choristers to sing outside the walls of the cathedral. In the event, the Dean's ban was not enforced and disaster was averted. 3 months later, on the 13th of April 1742, the first performance of Messiah in Dublin went ahead with singers from both the cathedral choirs, and as they say, the rest is history. Due to the destruction of the Public Records Office in the Four Courts during the Civil War in 1922, scholars since then are dependent on limited sources for information about the first performance of Messiah. These include Handel's autograph score in the British Library, the conducting score by Handel's assistant John Christopher Smith in the Bodleian Library, and the libretto printed in Dublin for the first performance. However, the names of 16 adult male singers, including Ralph Rosengrave, have been recorded, and there seem to have been 8 soloists, 5 of whom were members of both cathedral choirs. The female soloists included the contralto Susanna Chibber, younger sister of Thomas Arne, who was well known as an actress and singer in London. She had suffered from an abusive marriage and various scandals and came to Dublin about a fortnight after Handel to perform at Ainger Street Theatre. Handel heard her sing there and promptly engaged her for performances in the music hall of his opera Hymen on the 23rd and 31st of March. 2 weeks later, she sang the alto part in Messiah. The orchestra at the first performance of Messiah consisted of strings, 2 trumpets, timpani and harpsichord, but the exact size is not known. There was no organ in Fishamble Street Music Hall until the following autumn, but Handel brought his own bureau organ to Dublin with carrying handles. No pun intended. And it was probably used at the first performances by Handel himself. Donald Burrows suggests that the original chorus probably consisted of only 3 or 4 voices to a part, so that a small group of expert singers might have been able to achieve more virtuosity in some of the choruses and a higher level of detail and expression. Since the 19th century, as you know, performances of Messiah by large amateur choral societies are very different from the early performances. Apart from the Utrecht Te Deum and the Coronation Anthem, very little of Handel's choral music had been performed in Dublin before his visit. He soon made up for this when he arrived in Dublin by flooding the market with first performances of his choral works in the music hall. In December, L'Allegro, Il Penseroso ed Il Moderato was performed and repeated twice at concerts in January and March. The opera Acis and Galatea and the Ode for St. Cecilia's Day were performed at 2 concerts in January. In February, there were 2 performances each of the oratorios Esther and Alexander's Feast. And in March, there were 2 performances of the opera Hymen. On the 7th of April, only 2 days before the public rehearsal of Messiah, there was another performance of Esther. The overwhelming success of Messiah a week later led to numerous performances in Dublin of other oratorios by Handel at charity concerts. These are documented by Brian Boydell in his book, Dublin Musical Calendar 1700 to 1760. For example, Boydell reports that during the 1749 to 50 season, there were 36 performances in Dublin of 16 large-scale choral works. These included 7 performances of Acis and Galatea, 3 performances of the oratorio Joshua, which had never been heard in Dublin before, and 10 other oratorio performances, in addition to choral works by Purcell, Boyce, and Purcell. However, by 1755, public taste was beginning to change. Although Messiah was still given an annual performance, there were far fewer oratorio concerts. In March 1760, Matthew Dubourg, who was then based in London, conducted Messiah in Fishamble Street, which was then a theatre, almost 18 years after he had led the orchestra for the first performance of the oratorio in Fishamble Street Music Hall. A week later, Handel's Athalia, the only oratorio to be performed in Dublin that year, was presented in the same theatre for the benefit of the widows and children of vicars choral of the cathedrals. The vogue for oratorio was waning. Italian opera was going to become the new fashion, but that's a story for another day. We have travelled full circle in our journey from the 17th century. We've retraced the steps of Handel in Dublin and have placed his visit in the context of the history and evolution of choral music in Ireland. To conclude, I would like to return to Dublin Castle for the most serene Anne's 46th birthday, to listen to the finale from Cousser's chamber opera, The Universal Applause of Mount Parnassus, by Ensemble Marsyas, directed by Peter Whelan. So, while appropriately the wheels of time are moving, let's go back to 1711 for that joyful celebration, ending perhaps with fireworks on the Liffey.